This video is not sponsored by Netflix, but it could be. Hey history heroes, I'm Tempest and welcome to Time with Tempest, where today we're going to be talking about the man behind Netflix's new movie, The Dig. And if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel to see what hidden history I uncover next. Now, let's begin our story. Basil Brown was born in Suffolk in 1888 to a farming family, and as a child could often be found digging up fields. He was intellectually curious, studying astronomical textbooks since the age of 5. And despite his parents' poor background, he went to school and received private tutoring. However, at the age of 12, he had to drop out to help on his father's farm. He continued his education by reading textbooks and listening to radio broadcasts to teach himself Latin, French, Greek, German, and Spanish. He got married and inherited his father's farm upon his father's death. But as Brown's interest in astronomy grew, and the farm was too small to make a profit, he sold the farm and decided to throw himself into his passions. After joining an organization for amateur astronomers, he published a book called Astronomical Atlases, Maps, and Charts, a historical and general guide. This book was unique. Basil Brown brought the lofty concepts of astronomy down to earth and made them accessible to people who had no prior knowledge of the subject matter. In the meantime, he pursued archaeology, once again self-taught, and uncovered many Roman settlements, medieval buildings, and ancient roads in his area. After he uncovered a significant Roman kiln, 𝐓𝐢𝐩𝐬𝐬 took notice and began to utilize his skills on a contractual basis in 1935. Even though the pay was less than a farmhand, roughly 107 pounds a week in today's money, he was doing what he loved, and oftentimes shared his knowledge with locals who came to observe, encouraging children to take part in his digs to spark their curiosity about archaeology. Then, along came Edith Pretty, a landowner who had 18 mounds on her estate of Sutton Hoo. After approaching the curator of 𝐓𝐢𝐩𝐬𝐬, Guy Maynard, about the possibility of excavating the mounds, he recommended Basil Brown for the job. In 1938, he was contracted for 2 weeks to excavate 3 mounds: Mound 3, Mound 2, and Mound 4. Though much of the mounds had been looted since the Middle Ages, Mound 2 revealed a surprise: ship rivets, Bronze Age pottery, and a bead. Brown recognized the significance of this find and requested materials on the Snape ship burial from the 19th century. This burial was the first proven Anglo-Saxon ship burial, but was also unfortunately shoddily done. Little evidence exists of the ship or grave goods, and it wouldn't have been very helpful to Mr. Brown anyway. Sadly, Mound 2 only yielded a small ransacked ship that had actually been cut in half and placed on top of one another. But even then, it was an amazing find. Excited by the possibility of another Anglo-Saxon ship burial, Basil Brown returned to Edith Pretty's estate for another round of excavation in 1939, this time focusing on Mound 1. In Mound 1, he began finding rivets larger than the ones found in Mound 2, indicating an even larger ship. He immediately cycled to 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐬𝐬𝐬 to report his findings, who requested he proceed with utmost caution and care at this potentially significant find. Brown continued his excavation, and soon, an extraordinary discovery was made. He had begun to uncover a 27-meter-long ship that had been buried in the earth since the 7th century, and robbers had not been able to reach the burial chamber. Thus, all the grave goods were intact. Because of the astonishing find, Guy Maynard requested Edith Pretty turn the dig over to the British Museum. Fearing delays in the work, she refused, and Brown continued his excavation until a Cambridge University academic archaeologist caught wind of the dig. His name was Charles Phillips, and he initiated a meeting between the British Museum, the Office of Works, Cambridge University, 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐬𝐬𝐬, and the Suffolk Institute, who overruled Mrs. Pretty and gave control of the excavations to Phillips. Phillips was not a fan of Guy Maynard, a country curator, or Basil Brown, a self-taught excavator, so the original local team working on the dig was no longer welcome. Despite being the person to request that the larger academic institutions be included, Guy Maynard and Ipswich Museum were no longer allowed to take part in the dig or help with the finds. And Basil Brown couldn't even excavate the burial chamber that he had located. As work continued without the expertise of the local team, the rest of the ship was uncovered and the burial chamber excavated. Peggy Piggott, a young archaeologist, was the first to discover a burial object in the ship. In total, 263 objects were found, ranging from an ornate sword, to leather shoes, to a perfectly preserved ladybug. Of course, the most important find of all was the Sutton Who Helmet, described as one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made. Weighing 5.5 pounds and made of iron and bronze, it has a stunning array of highly intricate motifs and would have only been worn by someone of tremendously high status, such as a king. Other spectacular items include a purse lid, shoulder clasps, a long coat of ringmail, and a shield. These objects shattered people's perceptions of the Anglo-Saxons, as very few high-quality items had ever been found up until that point. Perhaps the only item to rival the Sutton Hoo finds was the Alfred jewel, uncovered in 1693. But with the sheer amount and quality of the items found at Sutton Hoo, that period between the Romans and the Normans was emerging as a time of great artistry and culture. The Dark Ages, as they were called, were not dark at all. The great Roman society that left Britain did not leave a void, but instead allowed a stunning new society to emerge with its breathtaking beauty. After Phillips and his team had found all the objects, they transported them to 𝐓𝐢𝐩𝐸 tube station for safekeeping due to the looming threat of World War II. Basil Brown and a farmhand carefully laid hessian and bracken over the excavated ship to preserve it, and reburied it for future generations. He then testified at the treasure trove inquest to determine the true ownership of the finds at Sutton Hoo. They ultimately ruled that Edith Pretty owned every piece of the treasure found. Realizing the significance of the Sutton Hoo treasure and putting aside all personal feelings, Edith Pretty donated all the objects to the British Museum so they could be viewed by as many people as possible. Her donation was, and still is, the greatest donation in British history. Sadly, she never got to view the objects on display, as she passed away in 1942. Her estate is now owned by the National Trust, who care for it and maintain it, while educating visitors on the importance of Edith Pretty and Sutton Hoo. As for Basil Brown, he continued his excavation work around Suffolk until 1965, when at the age of 77, he suffered a stroke or heart attack. He retired from his work then, before passing away at the age of 89 in 1977. The Sutton Hoo objects that he located went on display in the British Museum in the 1950s, but he was not credited or even acknowledged. And while that does seem strange, that's just the tradition of old-fashioned British classism. You see, being from a working-class background, Mr. Brown was not an Oxford-educated academic, and he hadn't written scholarly articles that could only be read by a handful of peers. He was a true man of the people, writing a book that could be understood by everyone, and encouraging a love of archaeology by inviting people from all walks of life to participate. But because of this, he wasn't in the same circles as those who worked in museums, and didn't have the prestige that comes with an academic background. So when the artifacts were displayed in the British Museum, the labels made it seem like the objects simply popped out of the ground at the museum's feet. Basil Brown never lived to see his work properly acknowledged. And there are still more Basil Browns out there in the world, ordinary people who have done extraordinary things that have yet to receive any credit for their contributions. Because even though class systems are less rigid now, they're still an ingrained part of British culture. 20.8% of people working in museums, galleries, and libraries are from a working class background, with an overwhelming majority working in quote-unquote unskilled positions, such as retail. So it's no wonder that until recently, Basil Brown had not received any recognition from institutions like the British Museum. People from all backgrounds are continuously making groundbreaking discoveries and providing new research to their field. But good news, history heroes! If they follow Basil Brown's trajectory, they only have to wait another 50 or so years after their discovery to even be a footnote in an object label. That being said, I'm glad Netflix finally gave Basil Brown the recognition he so rightly deserved, and gave us pause to reflect on what we leave behind, in whatever form that takes. So if you haven't already, go ahead and check out The Dig on Netflix. And remember to thank Basil Brown and Edith Pretty for their incredible contributions to the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please remember to subscribe, distribute your delight, or leave your calling card in the comments below because the YouTube algorithm gods demand it. Until next time, stay curious, history heroes.